They dismissed her as shy, until her flawless Swahili revealed the investor's hidden intention. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Emma Matthews had always been the quiet one. To the world, she was just another shy waitress working the late shifts at a fancy restaurant in downtown Manhattan. She spent her days carrying trays of expensive food, refilling glasses, and smiling politely at the wealthy customers who never noticed her beyond her uniform. But little did anyone know, Emma wasn't just a waitress. She had a secret that only a few people had ever seen. It was the night that everything changed. The restaurant was bustling as usual, the clink of fine china and the murmur of high-end conversations filling the air. It was the perfect setting for one of New York's wealthiest investors, Mark Williams, to entertain potential clients over dinner. Known for his cold demeanor and his sharp business mind, Mark was the kind of person who never wasted a second. When he entered the restaurant, the room seemed to grow colder. He barely glanced at the staff, focusing solely on his phone. His clients followed him in, nodding their heads in approval of his presence. But it was clear, they weren't there for pleasantries. Emma was assigned to his table. As she approached with a menu, Mark didn't even look up, brushing her off with a casual wave. "Bring me a bottle of your finest red wine," he muttered, still engrossed in his phone. "And make sure it's something that pairs well with steak." Emma nodded politely, but as she turned to leave, she overheard a snippet of conversation that caught her attention. Mark and his clients were talking about a major business deal, and as always, the tone was arrogant, dismissive. "The market is full of idiots who don't understand the value of what we're offering," one of the clients said in a thick accent. Mark nodded, agreeing. "It's all about knowing the right people, and these people don't even speak the language of business." Emma's curiosity piqued. She had been trained in business and international relations before turning to waitressing, a career shift she'd made years ago due to personal circumstances. The mention of language wasn't lost on her. She had spent years learning Swahili, and it had become a key asset in her career. Her expertise in the language was something she kept hidden, a small detail of her life that only a handful of people knew. But tonight, something was different. She could feel it. As she returned to their table with the wine, Emma's instincts told her to listen closely. She overheard Mark and his client discussing a business deal that involved land acquisition in Kenya. Emma, with her background in international markets, recognized the unethical terms they were discussing. Without thinking, she approached the table and, in perfect Swahili, interjected. "Excuse me, but the valuation you're discussing is incorrect," she said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Mark froze. His gaze locked onto Emma, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He didn't expect a waitress, especially one like her, to speak Swahili so fluently. His clients were equally stunned, their jaws dropping. "Did she just speak Swahili?" one of them whispered. Emma stood there, her posture unwavering, as she explained in detail why the deal they were discussing would lead to financial ruin for the local communities they were targeting. She had studied international development and had worked with NGOs in the past. She knew the region, the politics, and the intricacies of land rights better than anyone at the table. "I believe you've misunderstood the market conditions there," she continued. "The economic environment in Kenya is more complex than you realize." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. He had underestimated her, but now he saw something more. Something beyond the surface. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice laced with both intrigue and respect. "Just a waitress with a deep interest in global markets," Emma replied, her voice steady and composed. She smiled faintly before adding, "Now, may I take your order, or would you prefer to continue discussing your business?" The change in Mark's demeanor was instant. He had come to dinner expecting to dominate the room, but Emma had done the unexpected. She had humbled him without even trying. And in that moment, Mark knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As Emma walked away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was someone worth paying attention to. Little did he know, This quiet waitress would be the key to unlocking more than just a business opportunity. It would be the key to understanding a world he had never truly seen before. As Emma walked back to the kitchen, her mind was racing. She had always kept her knowledge of global markets to herself, but something about the way Mark Williams had looked at her made her wonder if she had just crossed a line. She wasn't just another waitress. She never wanted to be, but the truth was, she had left her previous life behind for a reason. A life filled with ambition, power, and the kind of corruption that tainted everything it touched. She had chosen this quiet life in the restaurant, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. But now, Mark had made her question whether that was the right choice. Back in the kitchen, Emma tried to focus on the orders that piled up, but her mind kept drifting back to the dinner table. Mark Williams was a billionaire with an empire built on high-risk investments, but he had seen something in her. He had seen a side of her that no one else had. As the night went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Mark's words echoed in her mind. "Who are you?" She had answered with a smile, but deep down, she knew the answer was more complicated than he could ever imagine. Her mind wandered to the past, to the moments when she had walked away from a promising career in finance, choosing to protect her heart rather than feed the machine of corporate greed. She had learned too much about the world of power brokers and billion-dollar deals to ever feel comfortable in it again. But now, Mark's sudden interest in her expertise had stirred something in her, something she thought she had left behind. As she cleaned up her station, Emma overheard some of the other waitstaff gossiping about the big spender at table 7. They didn't know who he was, but they had heard the rumors. "I heard he's a big deal in the finance world," one of them said. "He's probably just here to eat and leave a big tip. That's how these guys work." Emma smirked, knowing full well that Mark's intentions were far from simple. He didn't tip because he was generous. He tipped to buy power, to make himself feel better than everyone else in the room. It was just another form of control. That thought made her uncomfortable. She hated that kind of power, the kind that came from wealth, manipulation, and a lack of empathy. But then, she remembered the way Mark had looked at her when she spoke. For the first time in years, she felt like someone had truly seen her. It wasn't just the money or the power that drew her in, it was his curiosity. That's what made him different from the others. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and when Emma's shift finally ended, she was exhausted. She slipped out the back door of the restaurant and into the cool night air, eager to forget the events of the evening. But as she walked down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't done with her yet. She had learned long ago that in the world of high-stakes business, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The next day, she tried to go about her routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. It wasn't just that he had been impressed by her knowledge of global markets. It was the way he had seemed genuinely interested in who she was beyond her job as a waitress. It had been years since someone had treated her like that. The more she thought about it, the more she felt a nagging sense of inevitability. She couldn't avoid it forever. If she wanted to move forward, she would have to confront what had been left behind. That evening, as she was leaving the restaurant, Emma found a note waiting for her in her locker. It was from Mark. "I'd like to continue our conversation," it read. "Meet me tomorrow at the office at 3. I have a proposition that I believe will be of interest to you." Her heart raced as she read the note. It was clear now that Mark wasn't just offering a job or an investment opportunity. He wanted something more, something that neither of them could deny. Emma stood there for a moment, torn between the life she had built for herself and the life that was calling her back. Could she really walk away from everything she had worked so hard for? Or would she take the risk, step back into a world she had left behind, and see what this new chapter had in store for her? The next day, Emma found herself standing in front of the sleek, modern building that housed Anderson Capital. The glass walls reflected the bright morning sun, casting an almost intimidating glow over everything. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so out of place. Her heart was racing, her palms slightly sweaty as she adjusted the sleeves of her jacket. It had been a long time since she'd stepped into the world of high finance, a world she had left behind in search of something simpler, something real. She had spent the last few years hiding in plain sight, working at the restaurant, blending into the background, trying to forget who she used to be. But here she was now, back in the world she had left behind, for a meeting she never asked for. As she entered the building, she was greeted by the pristine, polished floors and the quiet hum of productivity. The receptionist looked up, Her perfectly groomed eyebrows raised slightly as she scanned Emma's simple attire. It was clear Emma didn't fit in with the polished professionals around her. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but skeptical. Emma hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'm here to see Jack Anderson." The receptionist's eyebrows arched even higher, and she quickly checked the computer. "You must be Ms. Matthews. You're on his schedule. Please have a seat." Emma sat down, her legs stiff from the nerves that had taken over her body. She could feel the weight of the room as the other workers passed by, their eyes fixed on their screens, oblivious to her presence. The air felt heavy with ambition, a sharp contrast to the quiet, unassuming life she had built for herself. A few minutes later, the receptionist motioned for Emma to follow her. "Mr. Anderson will see you now." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she followed the receptionist through the sleek, open office spaces. The walls were made of glass, and she could see teams of analysts huddled over their desks, deep in concentration. When they reached the end of the hall, the receptionist gestured toward a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Jack Anderson was standing by his desk, his back turned as he reviewed some documents. His tailored suit was perfect, his posture commanding. He looked every bit the billionaire investor that he was. "Ms. Matthews," he said without looking up, his voice cool and professional. "Please, come in." Emma stepped inside, feeling the weight of his presence immediately. She had seen him from a distance, but now that she was standing in front of him, she realized how much more imposing he was up close. She could see the lines of stress on his face, the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of long hours and high stakes. He turned to face her, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of curiosity and evaluation. "Have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Emma sat down, trying to steady her nerves. She had been in high-powered meetings before, but this felt different. This felt personal. "So," Jack began, leaning back in his chair, "I wanted to meet with you because I believe you have something special, something that could benefit both of us. You've been working in a field that's far removed from what I do, but from what I saw last night, you have a deep understanding of business that could be very valuable." Emma felt the weight of his words settle on her. She had expected him to be direct, but this felt more like an interrogation than an opportunity. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm just a waitress." Jack's expression softened slightly, but the sharpness in his eyes remained. "I've done my research," he said, his tone measured. "You're not just a waitress, Emma. You've worked in finance, you've studied international markets, and you clearly know how to identify opportunities that others miss. What I'm offering you is a chance to use that knowledge in a way that could change your life." Emma's mind raced. She had left that world behind for a reason. The greed, the corruption, the backstabbing, it was all too much for her. She had walked away from a successful career because she couldn't stomach the games they played. But here was Jack, offering her a chance to return to that world. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Why would you want someone like me?" Jack studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because you don't play by the same rules as everyone else," he said finally. "You see things others don't. You're not blinded by the money or the power. You're real, and that's something this industry desperately needs." Emma felt a strange mix of emotions stir within her. She had always prided herself on being different, on staying true to herself. But was this really the opportunity she had been waiting for? Or was it just another trap waiting to snap shut? "I'm not interested in going back to that world," Emma said firmly. "I've made my choice, and I'm happy where I am." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no anger in his gaze. "I respect that," he said, "but I think you'll find that sometimes the world pulls us back in whether we want it or not." He slid a folder across the desk toward her. "This is a project I'm working on. I need someone who can see the potential, someone who isn't blinded by the noise. Take a look and let me know what you think." Emma stared at the folder, her mind racing. She had never been one to make decisions lightly, and this felt like a moment of no return. Was she ready to step back into the world she had left behind? Or would she walk away and continue the quiet life she had built for herself? The answer wasn't clear yet, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life was about to change, whether she was ready for it or not. Emma sat at the sleek conference table, the folder Jack had handed her now open in front of her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of the city below. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the intensity of the moment heavy in the air. She had spent the last few years distancing herself from this world, from the cutthroat ambition, from the pressure to constantly climb higher. But now, as she looked over the documents, the familiar pull of the financial world was starting to creep back in. The project Jack had presented was unlike anything she had seen before. It was risky, yes, but the potential was there, huge potential. It involved emerging markets, infrastructure development, and partnerships with governments in Africa and Asia. The numbers were staggering, the opportunities vast, but Emma couldn't ignore the nagging doubts in her mind. She had seen projects like this go south before. She had seen greed ruin people's lives. But Jack had said something that stuck with her. He had said that she was different, that she didn't play by the same rules as the others. And maybe that was true. She had always trusted her instincts, and they had never led her astray before. The thought of stepping back into this world wasn't as terrifying as it had been the night before. Instead, it felt like something she was meant to do, something that could bring the change she had always wanted to see. She looked up, finding Jack watching her from the other side of the table. His expression was neutral, but there was a spark of anticipation in his eyes. He was waiting for her response, waiting to see if she was ready to take the leap. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Emma didn't answer right away. She let the silence linger, weighing her options. She could walk away, keep her life simple, stay in the safe confines of the restaurant. Or she could dive in, head first, into the world she had left behind. The world where decisions were made in boardrooms like this one, where billions of dollars were at stake, and where power was the ultimate currency. She took a deep breath and closed the folder in front of her. "I think it's risky," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I think it's also worth the risk." Jack's lips curled into a small smile, his eyes narrowing slightly in approval. "I knew you'd see it that way," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You're the kind of person who doesn't back down from a challenge. And that's exactly what I need." Emma met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was walking a fine line, one that could either lead to great success or total failure. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive with possibility. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who had the power to change things. She could feel the weight of the responsibility, the knowledge that the decisions she made from this point on would have a lasting impact. But she was ready for it. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice steady, no hesitation. Jack stood up, his eyes locking with hers. "Now," he said simply. "I'll have my team reach out to you with the details. But the first step is simple. You're going to meet with some of the key partners we're working with. They'll need to see that you're not just another person with a fancy title. They'll need to see that you have the vision to back up the strategy." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be glamorous. But it was going to be real. She would have to prove herself, not just to Jack, but to the people who held the power to make this project a success. "I'll be ready," she said, standing up and shaking Jack's hand. As they walked out of the room together, Emma couldn't help but feel the surge of adrenaline course through her veins. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. She was back in the game. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone underestimate her. Emma's first day in the office was nothing like she had imagined. The polished glass walls and sleek modern design of the building felt like a world she didn't belong to. She had spent the last few years of her life in the familiar clink of dishes and the hum of conversation at the restaurant, a far cry from the buzz of high-level meetings and financial strategies being discussed behind the closed doors of Anderson Capital. She walked down the corridor, the sound of her heels echoing in the quiet, and found herself in front of a conference room where she was to meet with some of the key partners involved in the project. She had studied the folder Jack had given her the night before, memorizing every detail. She had no illusions about the challenge ahead, but something inside her had shifted. This was no longer about staying hidden. This was about proving herself, not just to Jack, but to the world. As she entered the room, she was met by 4 executives sitting around a long, glass table. They looked up as she walked in, sizing her up in an instant. These were not people who dealt with waitresses. These were the movers and shakers, the ones who made decisions that could shape economies. The silence in the room was palpable as Emma took her seat at the end of the table, far from the other executives. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Who was this woman, and why was she here? Jack had given her a brief introduction, but she knew it wasn't enough. The real work would come when she opened her mouth. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm and clear, but it carried a weight she didn't feel a moment ago. "I've gone through the proposal, and I have a few points I'd like to discuss." The room fell silent as she opened the folder in front of her and began to speak. She didn't shy away from the data. Instead, she tackled it head-on. The risk assessment, the market projections, and the potential pitfalls, all of it was laid out with precision and clarity. She had spent years studying emerging markets, and this project, despite its allure, had risks that couldn't be ignored. She highlighted the challenges they might face in sub-Saharan Africa, where the infrastructure was underdeveloped and the political landscape was volatile. The executives exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. But Emma pressed on, pointing out the flaws in the financial model, showing them how some of their assumptions were overly optimistic. It was bold, even daring. Most people in her position would have stayed quiet, not wanting to rock the boat. But Emma was no ordinary person. She had learned the hard way that silence only allowed the wrong things to happen. Jack sat at the head of the table, watching her intently. His gaze was steady, but she could see the slight curve of his lips as he saw how she commanded the room. It wasn't just the numbers she had gotten right. It was the way she carried herself. The room, which had initially felt cold and intimidating, now felt like it was her domain. The executives seemed to realize this too. One of them, a woman in her late 40s, broke the silence. "You're right," she said, her voice smooth, but with a hint of respect. "We've been looking at this through a very narrow lens. Maybe it's time to rethink our strategy." Emma nodded, her expression serious but not unfazed. "This is a high-risk venture, and I understand the potential rewards. But if we're going to make it work, we need to be realistic about the obstacles." The conversation shifted after that. They began to ask her more questions, probing into the specifics of the markets she was familiar with, the risks she had identified, and her thoughts on how to mitigate them. The meeting stretched on for over an hour, and by the end, Emma had not only contributed valuable insights, but had also managed to shift the direction of the project. As the meeting concluded, Jack stood up, his eyes meeting hers. "You've done well today," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "I knew I made the right choice." Emma stood too, gathering her things. "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied, keeping her voice even. But inside, a rush of excitement was building. She had done it. She had earned their respect. For the first time since she had walked into the building, she felt like she belonged here. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a key player in a multi-billion-dollar project. And as she left the room, she knew this was just the beginning. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was stepping into the light. That evening, when she returned to her small apartment, Emma couldn't help but replay the meeting in her mind. She had been nervous at first, but once she had spoken, everything had fallen into place. The weight of the decision to step back into this world no longer felt so heavy. In fact, it felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She took a deep breath and smiled. The journey she had started all those years ago, walking away from the corporate world to find peace, had led her back here. But this time, she wasn't just going to play the game. She was going to change the rules. The days following the meeting passed in a blur for Emma. She had expected to feel overwhelmed, but instead, she felt a sense of clarity, a calm certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Every time she stepped into the office at Anderson Capital, she felt more at ease, more confident. The initial awkwardness she had felt, being surrounded by people in suits and high-end technology, began to fade. She wasn't just a waitress here. She was someone who had the knowledge, the expertise, and the drive to make a real difference. Jack had kept his word. He sent her an email the day after the meeting with the list of partners they were working with. They were global players, the kind of people who controlled entire industries, and Emma was going to meet with them. These weren't just boardroom meetings where ideas were tossed around casually. These were high-stakes conversations, where every word could determine the future of entire projects. She prepared for each meeting as if it were a battle, studying the markets, the risks, and the opportunities with relentless focus. She had spent her nights reading reports and market trends, trying to anticipate every question, every challenge that might arise. The first meeting was with a group of investors who were skeptical of the project's potential. They were from a hedge fund with billions of dollars tied up in volatile markets, and they didn't take kindly to risks. But Emma wasn't intimidated. She had been in high-pressure situations before, and she knew how to stay calm and composed. As she entered the conference room, she could feel the tension in the air. The investors sat around the table, their eyes scanning her, sizing her up. They were used to dealing with people who wore designer suits and spoke in corporate jargon. Emma, in her modest blazer, was the odd one out. But she didn't let it faze her. She started by addressing the market projections they had been discussing. She pointed out the gaps in their analysis, showing them how the emerging market they were considering had tremendous growth potential, but only if they approached it with caution. "You're right to be cautious," she said, her voice steady. "But this market is poised for expansion. The key is identifying the right entry points and leveraging the local relationships we've already established." The investors exchanged looks, clearly surprised by her knowledge. They hadn't expected the waitress to know more than they did about the market they were investing in. One of them, a man in his early 40s, leaned forward and asked, "How can you be so sure?" Emma smiled, her confidence growing with every word. "Because I've seen it before," she said. "I've seen how the right investments, when done thoughtfully, can transform communities. I've seen businesses flourish in these markets when the right strategies are applied. The key is not rushing in blindly, but taking the time to understand the unique dynamics at play." There was a pause, and for a moment, Emma wondered if they were going to dismiss her. But instead, the room seemed to shift. The tension eased, and the investors began to ask more questions, probing into the specifics of her analysis. She was ready. She answered every question with precision, her knowledge of the region and its opportunities clear. By the end of the meeting, the investors were impressed, and they agreed to move forward with the project. As they left the room, Jack came over to her with a look of approval on his face. "Well done," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. "I knew you were the right person for this." Emma couldn't help but smile. The first meeting had gone better than she had hoped, and she felt a rush of excitement. But she knew this was just the beginning. There were more meetings ahead, more challenges to face. The project was far from guaranteed, and she had a long road ahead of her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready for whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Emma continued to meet with investors, government officials, and business leaders. Each meeting built on the last, and with every new discussion, she grew more confident in her abilities. She wasn't just learning from Jack anymore. She was teaching him, too. They would often stay late in the office, brainstorming ideas and strategies. She found herself enjoying the challenges, the fast-paced nature of it all. She had always been someone who thrived under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just about making money. This was about making a difference. One afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting, Jack asked her to stay back. As the last of the employees filed out, he turned to her with a serious expression. "There's something I want to discuss with you," he said. Emma raised an eyebrow, wondering what he had in mind. Jack walked over to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. He handed it to her, and she saw that it contained plans for a new partnership. A partnership that would bring the project to an entirely new level. "I want you to take the lead on this," he said. "You've shown me more than I expected. You've proven yourself time and time again. This is your chance to run the show." Emma stared at the folder in her hands, her heart racing. This was what she had been working toward. It wasn't just a chance to make a difference. It was a chance to build something from the ground up. She took a deep breath and looked Jack in the eye. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady. Jack smiled, his expression softening. "I knew you would be." Emma's first few days leading the new partnership were intense. She spent her time meeting with stakeholders, refining strategies, and diving deeper into the complexities of the markets they were about to enter. Every decision felt monumental, and the pressure was palpable. Jack had trusted her with the responsibility, and she was determined not to disappoint him or the partners who were now looking to her for guidance. The meetings were long, and the discussions were often heated, but Emma found herself thriving in this environment. She wasn't just contributing. She was leading, making critical decisions, and offering solutions that none of the other executives had thought of. But as the days went by, she began to sense something. A shift in the dynamic. Jack had always been supportive, but there were moments when she caught him observing her a little too closely, his gaze intense, and his questions more probing than usual. At first, She brushed it off as his natural curiosity about her work. After all, she had never been one to shy away from challenges, and Jack had always admired her sharp mind. But soon, she realized there was something more to it. Jack wasn't just interested in her work, he was interested in her. She felt it in the subtle way he would lean in when they spoke, in the quiet moments when their eyes met and held longer than necessary. Emma, ever the professional, tried to focus on the task at hand. She had come this far by keeping her emotions in check and focusing on the project, but the constant tension between them was starting to wear on her. She couldn't afford to let personal feelings cloud her judgment, especially not now. One late afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting, Jack invited her to stay behind. The others had left, and the office was empty except for the hum of the city outside. "I need to talk to you about something," Jack said, his voice low as he leaned against the desk. Emma stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame. "What's up?" she asked, her tone even, though she couldn't deny the nervous flutter in her chest. Jack looked up at her, his expression serious. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice soft but deliberate. "You've been doing amazing work, Emma. You've taken this project to places I didn't think were possible." Emma felt a flush creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you," she replied simply. "But it's not just about the work," Jack continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "You've changed things around here. You've made me see things differently." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and for the first time in their professional relationship, she felt a strange tension in the air. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, trying to keep her composure. Jack straightened up, pushing away from the desk, and walking toward her slowly. "What I mean is," he said, his voice now softer, more vulnerable, "you've made me question a lot of things. Not just about this project, but about myself. About what I'm really looking for." Emma's mind raced, but she didn't allow herself to react. She couldn't. She had worked too hard to get to this point, and letting personal feelings interfere would be a mistake. "Jack," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We're here to work. You hired me to lead this project, and I'm doing that. That's all that matters right now." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her with a mix of admiration and something else, something more personal. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I know," he said quietly, "but sometimes I wonder if we're not missing something by keeping everything so professional. I can't help but think that there's more between us than just business." Emma took a deep breath, trying to push the growing unease down. She had known this moment was inevitable. Jack had been watching her for weeks, and now, it seemed, the line between professionalism and personal interest had blurred. But she wasn't about to let it derail everything she had worked for. "Jack," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I came here to do a job, and that's what I'm focused on. If you want me to continue leading this project, then we need to keep things professional, no matter what's happening outside of that." Jack's face softened, and he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said, his tone regretful. "I shouldn't have crossed that line. I've been caught up in everything, and I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." Emma nodded, grateful that he understood. "Let's focus on the work," she said, her voice steady. "We have a lot to accomplish, and the project needs our full attention." Jack gave her a tight smile, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "Of course," he said, his voice returning to its usual professional tone. "Let's get back to it." But as Emma left the office that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed between them. She had drawn a line, but whether Jack would respect it in the long run remained to be seen. She couldn't afford to let this distraction derail her focus. The stakes were too high, and the future of the project, her future, was on the line. Emma walked into the office the next morning with a sense of resolve she hadn't felt before. The conversation with Jack the night before had left her unsettled, but it had also reinforced the importance of staying focused. She couldn't afford distractions, not now, not with everything at stake. The project was moving forward at full speed, and with every passing day, the pressure to succeed grew heavier. She had spent the night reviewing the financial projections and the partnership details, running the numbers over and over in her mind. It was a huge risk, but the potential rewards were undeniable. But as she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest updates on the project, she felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since she had taken this on, she wasn't doubting herself. She knew what she was doing. She had earned her place here. As the day progressed, Emma found herself in another high-level meeting. The partners and investors were gathered in the conference room, and she was at the front, leading the discussion. Jack was there too, sitting at the back, watching her with a quiet intensity. Emma didn't let it throw her off. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it well. So, the question now is how we handle the entry strategy, she said, looking around the room. The market is still volatile, but the growth potential is enormous. If we play our cards right, we can be the first to capitalize on this, but we need to act quickly. One of the investors raised a hand. You're confident we can move forward given the current instability? He asked. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. Absolutely. The instability is exactly what creates the opportunity. The key is to identify the right partners and secure the right resources. She went on to explain her strategy for approaching the market, outlining how they could mitigate risk by diversifying their investments and forming partnerships with local organizations. The room was silent as she spoke, every eye on her. When she finished, the room erupted into a flurry of questions, each one more intense than the last. But Emma didn't flinch. She answered every one with confidence, guiding the discussion and making sure no detail was left overlooked. Jack remained quiet, observing her carefully. He had always been sharp, able to see through the surface to what really mattered. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just impressed by her intelligence or her ability to think on her feet. He was watching something else, the way she commanded the room, the way her presence demanded respect. By the end of the meeting, the investors were nodding in agreement, their skepticism replaced by a newfound trust in Emma's ability to lead the project. They were ready to move forward. As the meeting adjourned, Jack approached her. You handled that well, he said, his voice low. You were impressive. Emma nodded, but she could feel the weight of his words. There was something in his tone that unsettled her, something beyond professional admiration. Thank you, she said, keeping her voice steady. She wasn't sure what Jack's intentions were, but she wasn't about to let anything distract her from the task at hand. You're welcome, Jack replied, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary. But you know, Emma, there's more at play here than just business. She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? She asked. Jack smiled faintly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Let's just say, I think you'll find that sometimes the world doesn't always follow the path we expect. You might think you're just here to lead this project, but I have a feeling you're going to find that there's a lot more waiting for you. Emma didn't respond immediately. She was too focused on what had just happened in the meeting. But Jack's words echoed in her mind as she left the office later that evening. She had come to this point by focusing on the work, by pushing aside everything else. But now, Jack had introduced a new element, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. The truth was, Emma had never been good at balancing business and personal life. She had chosen this path because it allowed her to escape from the mess of emotions and relationships that had once complicated her world. But now, with Jack's subtle hints and the growing tension between them, she was beginning to wonder if it was all just a matter of time before everything collided. She had spent years building walls around herself, walls that protected her from the chaos of the corporate world, and from people like Jack, who had the ability to break down those walls with nothing more than a glance. But as the days passed, Emma couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was time to take a risk, to let herself be vulnerable in ways she had never allowed before. She had made a name for herself, proven her worth, and now, for the first time, she was starting to ask herself what else she truly wanted. As she sat in her apartment that night, reflecting on everything that had happened, she knew that the next few months were going to be critical. Not just for the project, but for her. She was standing on the edge of something new, something that could change everything. But whether she was ready to step into that unknown, to embrace the possibility of something more than just business, was still unclear. She was going to have to make a choice soon. But for now, all she could do was wait and see where this journey would take her. Emma sat in her office the next day, reviewing the final details of the partnership deal. The project was progressing, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. She could feel it every time Jack entered the room, every time their eyes met across the conference table. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an unspoken connection that neither of them had addressed. The work came first, she reminded herself. It had to. She had come this far by focusing solely on the project, leaving everything else behind. But as the deadline for the deal loomed closer, she found herself increasingly distracted by the pull she felt toward Jack. He had been supportive, yes, but there was something about the way he watched her, the way he seemed to read her with just a glance, that unsettled her. She couldn't let herself get distracted. The project was far too important. One wrong move could unravel everything they had worked for. The next meeting was crucial. Emma had spent hours preparing for it, analyzing every risk and opportunity. The investors were tough, and the stakes were higher than ever. The pressure was building, but Emma wasn't afraid. She had handled tougher situations before. She was ready for this. The conference room was full when she arrived. The executives and investors were already seated, their eyes fixed on her as she walked in. She took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and sat at the head of the table. The room quieted, all attention on her. "Good afternoon," Emma began, her voice steady and confident. "I know we're all here to make sure that this partnership moves forward smoothly, so let's dive into the final details." She opened the folder in front of her and began walking the group through the financial projections. She addressed the concerns they had raised in previous meetings, offering solutions and adjustments where needed. She wasn't just speaking to the room, she was leading it. She could see the skepticism begin to fade as she spoke. Every question they asked, she answered with clarity, and by the end of the presentation, the investors were nodding in agreement. The tension that had filled the room when she first entered was gone, replaced with a sense of trust and respect. As the meeting adjourned, the investors filed out, their chatter filled with approval. Jack stayed behind, watching Emma as she gathered her papers. When the room cleared, he walked over to her. "That was impressive," he said, his voice low, just loud enough for her to hear. Emma looked up at him, her expression neutral but her pulse quickening. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "We're almost there. Just a few more hurdles to clear." Jack smiled, his eyes softening. "You've already cleared most of them. I don't think we would be this close if it weren't for you." Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she quickly tamped it down. This wasn't about her and Jack. This was about the project. This was about their future. "I'm just doing my job," she said, standing up and gathering the last of her things. Jack watched her for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity she couldn't ignore. "I know," he said quietly. "But sometimes, Emma, you do more than that. You make things happen." She turned to face him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "We're almost done," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "Then we can focus on the results." Jack nodded, but there was something else in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite place. "You're right," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I think you and I both know that what's coming next is going to change everything." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant by that, but she felt a shiver run down her spine. She couldn't afford to let herself be distracted. Not now. Not with everything on the line. "Let's just finish this," she said, her voice firm. "That's what matters right now." Jack nodded again, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and walked toward the door. Emma watched him go, her mind racing. She had done it. She had led the project to the brink of success. The investors were on board, and the deal was nearly signed. But as she looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than just business. She had stepped into a world she had long tried to avoid. But now, there was no turning back. She had made her choice. And as the days passed and the final details of the project were completed, Emma found herself facing a new reality. A reality where her career, her personal life, and her feelings for Jack were all intertwined in ways she hadn't anticipated. The journey she had started was about to take an unexpected turn. And as she stood at the threshold of this new chapter, Emma realized that the hardest decisions were yet to come. As Emma walked into the office the next morning, she could feel the weight of everything coming to a head. The project was nearing completion, and everything was on track, but the tension between her and Jack had been growing. She couldn't ignore it anymore. It was becoming impossible to separate the business from the personal. The conversations they had been having lately, the subtle glances, the unspoken words, everything felt charged with something neither of them had addressed. But today, the focus was on the deal. The partners were coming in for the final presentation, and Emma had spent the past few days ensuring every detail was perfect. She wasn't going to let anything, not even her complicated feelings, get in the way of this moment. The conference room was bustling with energy when she arrived. The executives were already seated, the tension palpable. Everyone was waiting for her. As Emma stepped to the front of the room, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. She had done this 100 times before, but today felt different. She could feel Jack's presence at the back of the room, his eyes on her, and it made her heart race just a little faster. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and confident. "Today, we're here to finalize the last details of this deal. We've worked hard to get here, and now it's time to make this partnership a reality." She began walking the team through the final figures, breaking down the market projections and the revenue potential for the next 5 years. The partners listened intently, asking questions as she went along. Emma answered each one with precision, her knowledge of the numbers, the markets, and the risks evident in every word she spoke. As the meeting progressed, she could see the approval in their eyes, the respect growing with every detail she revealed. She was no longer just the waitress turned expert. She was the leader of this project, and they were starting to see her as such. When she finished her presentation, there was a moment of silence. Then, one of the senior partners spoke up. "This is impressive," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You've managed to take a complicated venture and simplify it in a way that gives us confidence. I think we're ready to move forward." The room erupted in agreement, the partners nodding in approval. Emma could feel the weight lift off her shoulders. She had done it. The deal was set. They were ready to sign. As the meeting adjourned, the partners filed out, congratulating her on the success of the project. Jack was the last to leave. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "You did a great job," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something else. Emma nodded, her emotions still on edge. "Thank you," she replied, trying to keep things professional. Jack looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "I know this project has meant a lot to you," he said, his voice softer now. "And I've been impressed with how you've handled everything. But I think we both know that there's more between us than just business." Emma felt a wave of anxiety rush over her. She had known this conversation was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. "Jack," she said, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to stay calm. "We've worked together. That's what matters. Let's keep it that way." Jack took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "You're not just another person in a suit to me, Emma. I don't think I've ever met someone like you before. And it's not just your work, it's you. I can't ignore it anymore." Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. She had spent so long building walls, making sure she never got too close to anyone. She wasn't about to let those walls come down now, not with Jack, not when everything was at stake. "Jack," she said, her voice firm, "this project is bigger than either of us. Let's not complicate it." Jack's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed to reconsider. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice filled with understanding. "I shouldn't have brought this up now. But you should know, Emma, I admire you, more than you probably realize." Emma didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't ready for it, and she wasn't sure she ever would be. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let anything derail her progress. "Let's focus on what's ahead," she said, her voice steady, "and leave everything else behind." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he turned and left the room. Emma stood there for a moment, her heart still racing. She had made her choice. She had drawn the line, and she wasn't going to let anything cross it. She had worked too hard to let herself get caught up in something she couldn't control. But as the days passed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of something she hadn't expected. Something that wasn't just about business. Something that was personal, and maybe, just maybe, it was the hardest challenge of all. The following week, the project reached its final stages. The deal was almost ready to be signed, and everything was in place. But despite the progress, Emma couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. There were moments when the tension between her and Jack felt almost unbearable, as though the professional distance they had carefully maintained was on the verge of cracking. Each time they interacted, the air was thick with unsaid words and lingering glances. She had tried to ignore it, to focus solely on the project, but the more she worked with Jack, the more complicated things became. As the final meeting loomed closer, Emma found herself questioning everything. She had come into this world to prove herself, to show that she could handle the business side of things, that she could lead a project with as much authority as anyone else in the room. But Jack's presence, his unspoken admiration, had begun to stir feelings in her that she wasn't prepared for. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, keeping her emotions in check, but now, with every interaction, those walls seemed to weaken. One late evening, after a particularly exhausting day of negotiations, Emma found herself alone in the office with Jack. The others had left, and the building was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She was reviewing the final documents when Jack walked in, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low. "I think this project is going to be a game changer." Emma looked up from the papers, her eyes meeting his. "It is," she agreed, her voice steady. "It's been a lot of hard work, but we're on the right track." Jack leaned against the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've done more than just work hard, Emma," he said quietly. "You've changed everything." Emma felt her heart race, but she didn't allow herself to show it. She had to stay focused. "We've all worked hard," she replied, trying to keep things professional. "It's a team effort." Jack smiled faintly, but there was something in his expression that made her uneasy. "It's more than that," he said softly. "I think we both know that." There was a long pause as their eyes locked. Emma could feel the weight of his words, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to fade. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, feel the tension between them growing with every passing second. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she looked down at the papers on the desk, trying to focus on anything other than the way Jack was looking at her. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to remain composed. Jack took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I think you do," he said quietly. "I think we both know that there's more to this than just business." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had known this was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't do this. This thing between us, it's not the time." Jack's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that took her by surprise: vulnerability. "I know," he said, his voice low. I've never met anyone like you, Emma. You're different, and I can't ignore that." Emma felt a surge of emotion rise within her, but she pushed it back, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. "We're almost done with this project," she said firmly. "Let's not complicate it. We need to finish this." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't want to complicate things either. But I can't pretend that there's not something here." Emma felt the weight of his words settle on her. She had always been someone who thrived in control, someone who kept her emotions in check, but Jack had a way of breaking through her defenses. She wasn't sure if that scared her or if it was something else. "We need to focus on the project," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing. "That's what matters. Nothing else." Jack gave a small smile, though his eyes were filled with something deeper. "You're right," he said. "I'll respect that. But Emma, you should know, I'm not going anywhere." She met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just talking about the project. He was talking about them. She didn't know what to say to that. Instead, she nodded, gathering the papers in front of her and standing up. "We'll finish this," she said firmly, walking toward the door. "And then we'll figure out what comes next." Jack didn't respond, but as she walked past him, she felt his eyes on her. The next few days were a whirlwind. The final negotiations went smoothly, and the deal was signed without any major hiccups. The project was officially a success, and Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as the announcement went out to the press. But as she stood in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by colleagues and partners, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had accomplished what she set out to do. She had proven herself in the world of business. But in doing so, she had also opened herself up to something she wasn't ready for. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing was ever going to be the same again. The days following the successful deal were a blur of celebrations, meetings, and the constant hum of success that Emma had worked so hard to achieve. The project had officially been launched, and the future looked promising. Emma stood on the edge of something big, something that could shape the next phase of her career, but despite the success, a quiet unease lingered in her chest. She couldn't ignore the tension that still simmered between her and Jack. Their professional relationship had remained intact, but the undercurrent of something more had not disappeared. Emma had tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the work, but every time she saw Jack, every time their paths crossed, there was a spark, something unspoken that made her heart race just a little faster. She had tried to be rational. She had tried to remind herself that their personal dynamics were irrelevant to the success of the project. But deep down, she couldn't deny the chemistry that lingered between them. One evening, after the final press conference about the project's success, Emma found herself alone in the office, going through the last of the paperwork. It was late, and the building was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. She had just finished reviewing the financial projections when she heard the faint sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Jack standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his eyes serious. "It's late," he said, his voice low. "What are you still doing here?" Emma paused for a moment, considering the question. She hadn't realized how late it had gotten. "Just finishing up," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "The final numbers need to be double-checked before we send them out to the partners." Jack stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind him. "You've been working nonstop since the deal was signed," he said, his voice softer now. "You deserve a break." Emma forced a smile, trying to keep things light. "I'm fine. There's just a lot to wrap up. You know how it is." Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. "I don't think you've taken a moment to really enjoy the success," he said quietly. "You've earned it. You should be celebrating." Emma set the papers down, meeting his gaze. She could feel the intensity of his eyes on her, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air between them. "I'm not interested in celebrating," she said, her voice steady. "There's still work to be done. We're not finished yet." Jack didn't move away, his gaze lingering on her. "I think you're missing something," he said, his tone almost tender. "You've done something incredible, Emma. You should let yourself feel proud of that." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was his words or the way he was looking at her, but the moment felt charged with emotion. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself taking a step closer to him, the space between them shrinking with every passing second. Jack's expression softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She had been pushing away her feelings for so long, but in that moment, she couldn't deny them anymore. Jack was right. She had worked hard, and maybe it was time to let herself enjoy the success. Maybe it was time to take a step forward, both in her career and in her life. She reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was small, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through her. Jack's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to fade, and all that remained was the quiet space between them. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with an emotion she hadn't expected. "I know we've been focused on this project, but I need you to know, I've never met anyone like you. You've done more than I could have ever hoped for." Emma swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She had never expected to hear those words from him, especially not after everything they had been through. "Jack," she began, but she didn't know how to finish. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping her distance, but now the walls she had built were starting to crumble. Jack took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I don't want to complicate things," he said, his voice low. "But I can't pretend that I don't feel something more. I don't want to pretend anymore." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had been trying so hard to keep things professional, to keep her emotions in check, but now, standing in front of him, she realized that it was no longer possible. She started, but the words caught in her throat. Jack reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. I just want you to know how much you mean to me." And in that moment, Emma felt something shift inside her. She had spent so long running from her feelings, from the possibility of something more, but now, as Jack held her close, she realized that sometimes, taking a leap of faith was the only way forward. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever happened next, things would never be the same again. The weeks following that moment with Jack passed in a whirlwind of decisions and developments. The project had officially launched, and Emma was now overseeing its execution with confidence, leading meetings, managing partnerships, and ensuring that every detail was attended to. Yet, despite the professional success, there was a lingering sense of uncertainty. She couldn't ignore the way things had shifted between her and Jack. The lines between business and personal were becoming increasingly blurred, and Emma found herself walking a fine line between the two. As much as she tried to focus on the work, she couldn't shake the pull she felt toward him. They had both agreed to keep their relationship professional, but every glance, every touch, seemed to speak a language they weren't willing to acknowledge. Emma knew that the next step was the most crucial. The project had entered a critical phase, and they were all waiting for the final results of the partnerships they had secured. Investors were eager to see the first returns, and Emma was determined to make sure that everything went smoothly. But as the deadline approached, the pressure became nearly unbearable. It wasn't just the project anymore. It was everything. The weight of her feelings for Jack, the expectations of everyone around her, and the looming uncertainty of what would happen once the deal was done. She found herself alone in the office late one night, reviewing the last of the reports, when Jack entered. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Emma looked up, her gaze meeting his. "There's a lot to go over," she replied, her voice tired but steady. Jack stepped closer, his presence calming in the midst of the chaos. "You've done more than enough, Emma," he said gently. "We're ready. You've given it everything you have." Emma didn't respond immediately. She was tired, yes, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion. That weighed on her. It was the emotional strain of everything she had been holding back. "I don't know what's next," she said finally, her voice quiet. "After this, I mean. What happens when the project is finished?" Jack's eyes softened, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. "We'll figure that out when the time comes," he said. "But you're not alone in this, Emma. I've got your back, no matter what." She looked at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "I've spent so long running from what I really want," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've built walls, pushed people away, because I was scared. Scared of getting hurt, scared of losing control." Jack reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "You don't have to keep everything inside." For a moment, Emma allowed herself to lean into his touch, feeling the strength in his presence. She had built her life around control, around keeping her emotions at bay, but with Jack, she felt like maybe it was time to let go. "Maybe it's time to stop being afraid," she whispered, her heart racing with the possibility of what might come next. Jack's hand lingered on her shoulder, and in that moment, everything felt like it could change. The business, the project, their future, it all seemed to be converging in this quiet, vulnerable moment. "Whatever comes next," Jack said, his voice low, "we'll face it together." Emma nodded slowly, a sense of peace settling over her. She had spent so long questioning everything, her choices, her future, her feelings, but now, for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't have to have all the answers. All she needed was the courage to take the next step. As she looked at Jack, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt ready to embrace it. The project was a success, but this was just the beginning. There were bigger challenges ahead, both in her career and in her heart. But now, with Jack by her side, she was ready to face them. She didn't know exactly where their path would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer running from it. As she walked out of the office that night, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of a future that was finally within her grasp. She wasn't just the leader of the project anymore. She was taking control of her life, her choices, and her heart, and that was a victory in itself. In this heartwarming journey, Emma takes on an unexpected challenge that transforms her career and her life. From humble beginnings in a quiet restaurant to leading a high-stakes project with global investors, she proves that hard work, determination, and self-belief can lead to extraordinary success. As Emma navigates the complexities of the business world, she finds herself facing more than just professional challenges. With the growing tension between her and Jack, the lines between business and personal emotions blur, creating a beautiful and complex story of growth, vulnerability, and unexpected connections. Along the way, Emma's transformation is not only about succeeding in her career, but also learning to embrace her emotions and the possibility of love. As the project nears its successful conclusion, Emma realizes that the hardest decisions are not about business, but about taking the leap into a new chapter of her life. These touching stories will resonate with anyone who has ever faced personal and professional crossroads, offering a reflection on courage, choices, and the power of human connection. As Emma and Jack learn, the true reward comes from embracing both the challenges and the beautiful moments that come with them. This collection of touching stories shows that, sometimes, success is not just about the destination, but about the journey itself and the relationships we build along the way. Whether it's overcoming doubts or finding love in unexpected places, this narrative is filled with touching stories that will inspire and move you.